The snow fell in silent, indifferent curtains, blanketing the jagged peaks of the Silverwood Mountains in a shroud of pristine white. For the wolves of the Northern Ridge Pack, this purity was a thing to be celebrated, a reflection of their own fanatical obsession with pure bloodlines and pale perfection. The Grand Hall, carved into the mountainside, blazed with light and warmth, a stark contrast to the desolate cold Zola felt seeping into her very bones. She sat alone at a small, forgotten table near the back, a solitary shadow in a sea of glittering silver and white fur cloaks. Her skin, the color of rich earth and warm honey, was a stark affront to their world of snow and ice. Her hair, a cascade of tight, dark coils, absorbed the light while the pale, straight hair of the others seemed to reflect it like spun moonlight. She was a hybrid, a mistake, a living symbol of everything they despised. Tonight was the wedding of Alpha Damien, the man who had been her fated mate, and a man who had rejected her in front of the entire pack. His words were a brand on her soul, a constant, echoing reminder of her worthlessness. A hybrid cannot be Luna, he had sneered, his voice laced with disgust as his eyes raked over her. Your blood is tainted. Your skin is a mark of shame. You are a blight on this pack, an outcast. I, Alpha Damien, reject you. The memory was a physical thing, a phantom hand that squeezed her heart until she couldn't breathe. Now, he was marrying Lyra, a she-wolf whose bloodline was as pure as the mountain snow and whose skin was as pale as milk. Zola had been commanded to attend, a final, cruel twist of the knife to demonstrate her utter irrelevance. Every whisper was a tiny razor, every sideways glance a stone thrown at her already bruised spirit. They called her the Dusk Stain, the Mud Blood. They wondered aloud why she even bothered to show her face, how she could bear the shame. She clutched the rough-spun fabric of her simple brown dress, her knuckles white. She had thought, foolishly, that she could endure it, that she could sit here, invisible, and prove that their hatred meant nothing. But it meant everything. It was the air she breathed, the food she ate, the icy ground she slept on. Her inner wolf, a timid and shamed creature, whimpered within her, begging to flee, to run until her paws bled and her lungs burned, to escape this suffocating cage of prejudice. She could feel the tears beginning to well, hot and sharp, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Pushing her chair back with a soft scrape that went unnoticed in the cacophony of celebration, Zola prepared to slip away into the blizzard, to find solace in the storm that mirrored the one in her heart. Just as she rose, a presence descended upon the space beside her, so vast and absolute that it silenced the air. The boisterous laughter, the clinking of glasses, the idle chatter, it all died in an instant. A hush fell over the Grand Hall, thick with shock and a sudden, primal fear. Zola froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She could feel the immense, ancient power rolling off him in waves, a pressure that made the very stones of the mountain seem to tremble. It was the Alpha King, King Kalen, a monarch of myth and legend, who ruled all packs from his isolated throne in the frozen north. He was a creature of immense power and terrifying reputation, a king who hadn't been seen in the lower territories for over a century. No one knew why he had chosen to attend this particular wedding, but his presence had cast a pall of nervous reverence over the entire affair. And now, he was sitting at her table, her pathetic, isolated, outcast table. Slowly, her mind screaming at her to run, she lowered herself back into her seat. She dared not look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the whorls in the wooden tabletop. She could feel the collective gaze of 1,000 wolves on her, no longer filled with scorn, but with stunned, terrified disbelief. Then he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like the shifting of glaciers deep within the earth, devoid of any discernible emotion. Pretend like you're with me. The words were not a request. They were a quiet, unshakable command. Zola's breath hitched. What did he want? Was this some new, crueler form of mockery? To be singled out by the king himself, only to be cast aside for his amusement. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But the alternative, to disobey the Alpha King, was unthinkable. With trembling hands, she clasped them in her lap, straightened her spine, and nodded almost imperceptibly, her gaze still glued to the table. The silence in the hall stretched on, taut and heavy. She could feel his focus, not on her, but on the room, a silent warning to all who watched. His proximity was a fortress, an invisible wall that deflected the daggers of their stares. "They serve bitter wine at these southern weddings," he stated, his voice still a monotone, yet it cut through the silence and forced the world to restart. Zola flinched, realizing he was speaking to her, expecting an answer. She swallowed, her throat dry as dust. I wouldn't know, Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I have not been offered any." A beat of silence followed, and in it, she felt a subtle shift in the air around him, a change so minute she thought she might have imagined it. It was like the first crack in a sheet of ice. He didn't respond to her words. Instead, he raised a single hand, and a server, pale and trembling, scurried over with a flagon of the finest vintage. The king ignored the server completely, his attention fixed somewhere over her head. The server, utterly terrified, looked from the impassive king to the outcast girl, his confusion warring with his fear. Zola felt a flush of humiliation. Of course, the king wanted a drink, and she was merely the closest object to his line of sight. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking near her. But then, the king's voice rumbled again, lower this time, a thread of something sharp woven into the sound. "Pour for the lady." The server froze, his eyes wide with shock. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The lady? He meant her. He meant Zola, the dusk stain, the hybrid. The server's hands shook so violently that wine sloshed over the rim of the crystal goblet as he poured. He placed it before her and retreated as if fleeing a fire. Zola stared at the deep crimson liquid. It felt like a test, a trap. She didn't dare touch it. "Your former Alpha approaches," the king murmured, his voice a private warning meant only for her. "Do not show him your fear. You owe him nothing, not even your attention." Her head snapped up at that, her fear momentarily eclipsed by sheer astonishment. Her eyes, wide and luminous brown, met his for the first time, and the world stopped. King Kalen was not what she had expected. The legends painted him as a specter, a ruthless force of nature. But the man before her was devastatingly real. His features were sharp, carved from granite and shadow, with a severe beauty that was both terrifying and captivating. His hair was the color of a winter night, a stark black that fell over a brow etched with the weight of centuries. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were not the cold, dead chips of ice she'd imagined. They were molten gold, swirling with ancient power, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. A storm, a fire, a longing so profound it stole the air from her lungs. In that instant, a jolt went through her, a current of energy so powerful it felt like lightning striking the core of her being. It was a resonance, a humming recognition that vibrated from her soul to the tips of her fingers. It was nothing like the faint, one-sided pull she had felt for Damien. This was a cataclysm. This was destiny. Alpha Damien and his new bride, Lyra, stood before their table, their faces a mask of strained pleasantry. Damien's eyes, however, flashed with fury and disbelief as he saw Zola seated beside the king. "Your Majesty," Damien said, bowing low, his voice tight with forced deference. "We are honored by your presence. I did not realize you were acquainted with this 1 inch." He gestured dismissively toward Zola, the insult clear. "She is of no consequence. A stray my pack has tolerated out of pity." Before Zola could flinch, before the familiar shame could consume her, the king's golden eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. He didn't even deign to look at Damien. His gaze remained locked on Zola's, a silent communication passing between them. "You are mistaken, Alpha." Kalen's voice was now laced with the chill of 1,000 winters, a deadly quiet that promised violence. "You stand before your queen." The declaration fell into the cavernous silence of the hall. It was not a pronouncement. It was a fact, stated as simply as one might state that the sky is blue or the stars are fire. Disbelief, then shock, then outright horror rippled across the faces of the pack members. Lyra let out a small, strangled gasp, her perfectly pale face turning ashen. Damien stared, his jaw slack, his mind clearly unable to process the words. He looked from the king's implacable face to Zola's stunned one, searching for the joke, the trick. But there was no joke in the molten gold of the king's eyes. There was only a terrifying, possessive certainty. "My queen," Damien choked out, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. "Your Majesty, you must be mistaken. She is a half-breed, a worthless, tainted." Silence, the word was not shouted. It was a blade of pure power that sliced through the air, and Damien fell silent, choking on his own hatred as the king's aura pressed down on him, immense and suffocating. Kaelin finally tore his gaze from Zola to pin Damien with a look of utter contempt. "For centuries, I have walked this earth alone. The moon goddess promised me a mate, a counterpart to my soul, an anchor in the storm of eternity. I have searched through every pack, on every continent, waiting for the sign." He paused, and his golden eyes softened almost imperceptibly as they returned to Zola. His voice, when he spoke again, was filled with a raw, ancient emotion that cracked through his icy facade, a sound of pure, unadulterated reverence. "I felt her pain across 1,000 miles, a cry of a soul so pure, being tormented by insects. I came here for her. You cast her out into the cold, blind to the fire she holds within. You saw a flaw in her blood. I see the strength of two worlds united in a perfect being." He rose to his full, intimidating height, a towering figure of absolute authority. He extended a hand to Zola, his fingers long and elegant, yet radiating a strength that could shatter mountains. "They see a hybrid," he murmured, his voice for her alone now, a stark contrast to his public decree. "I see a warrior who has survived a war waged against her since the day she was born. I see a queen who has been forced to kneel in the snow for far too long." Zola stared at his outstretched hand, her mind reeling. Queen? His mate? The words were impossible, a fairy tale spun from madness. Yet, the feeling inside her, the thunderous call of her soul to his, was undeniable. This was real. The goddess had not abandoned her. She had been saving her. With a trembling hand, she placed her fingers in his. His touch was electric, a searing heat that chased away the perpetual chill that had lived in her heart for years. He gently pulled her to her feet, his grip firm and protective. He shrugged off his own magnificent cloak, a heavy garment of midnight black wolf fur, and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a cocoon of power and safety that smelled of pine, winter, and ancient magic. It swallowed her simple brown dress, marking her as his. He turned back to the stunned assembly, his arm possessively around Zola's waist, holding her close to his side. His voice boomed through the hall, imbued with the royal alpha command that no wolf could defy. "You have worshipped purity of blood as your highest virtue, yet you have allowed your spirits to become foul and corrupt. You praise pale skin that reflects the cold, but you fear the rich earth that gives life. You have mistaken cruelty for strength and prejudice for pride." His golden eyes found Damien, and the younger Alpha physically recoiled from the force of his fury. "You had a goddess in your midst, and you called her a stain. You rejected your Luna Queen, the other half of my soul. This insult will not be forgotten. The Northern Ridge Pack has been judged by its king, and it has been found wanting. There will be a reckoning." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Fear, stark and potent, replaced the scorn on every face. They were no longer looking at Zola the outcast. They were looking at their king's chosen, a woman who held their fate in the palm of her hand. Zola felt a strange power unfurl within her, a warmth spreading from the point of contact with Kaelin's hand. It was her own power, her own worth, a thing she'd been told she never had, now being reflected back at her through the eyes of the most powerful being she had ever met. Her inner wolf, so long cowed and silent, lifted its head, not with a whimper, but with a nascent, rising growl of pride. Kalen didn't wait for a response. He turned, his arm a solid bar of support around her, and began to lead her from the hall. The crowd parted before them like a receding tide, wolves scrambling to get out of their path, their heads bowed in submission and terror. Zola walked with her head held high for the first time in her life, the weight of the king's cloak a comforting reassurance on her shoulders. She did not look back at Damien's horrified face or at the ruins of the celebration. She looked forward into the blizzard, but she no longer felt its cold. As they stepped out into the swirling snow, the wind whipped around them, but within the circle of his presence, it was calm. He led her toward a path she had never seen, one that wound higher up the mountain toward the most treacherous, inaccessible peaks where his citadel was said to lie. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice soft but steady. "Home," he answered simply, his golden eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Our home." He stopped and turned to face her, cupping her cheek with his free hand. His thumb gently stroked her skin, his touch reverent, as if he were handling the most precious treasure in the world. "I am sorry it took me so long to find you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded like centuries of loneliness. "I will spend the rest of our eternity making up for the pain they caused you." Zola looked up into his fierce, beautiful face, and for the first time, she saw her own reflection in his golden eyes. She didn't see an outcast, a hybrid, a stain. She saw a survivor. She saw strength. She saw a queen. The tears she had refused to shed in the hall now fell freely, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of hope, of a profound and overwhelming love that was just beginning to bloom in the shelter of the winter storm. He leaned down and gently brushed the tears away with his lips, his first kiss a tender promise against her skin. "Your reign begins now, my queen," he whispered against her cheek, "and the world will learn to kneel." She finally, truly believed him. If you were moved by Zola's journey from rejection to royalty, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your favorite moment in the comments below.